at the, like fighting the Nadema pipeline out there at the Shinnecock resistance camp. So met a lot of great people out there, and this is a Salish song. This one's called Fly Eagle Fly. Thank you so much, everyone.
Before we begin, and as we're getting settled, two quick housekeeping things. One, I want to extend a lot of gratitude to Ugandi again for the work that they've done to help organize this group and bring us all together. I'm totally thankful for you. Second point, Morgan, would you mind raising your hand? Oh yes, please, a round of applause for Ugandi and the organization. And second, I'm going to put you on the spot, Morgan. Please raise your hand so everyone can see you. This event does not happen without Morgan's incredible work. I feel very lucky and privileged to work with you, so thank you so much. So to begin, I want us to consider context, right? And think about what it means to be in Lenape Hoking and to orient ourselves to that through Lenape perspective. So I want to turn to you, River, first. And again, we're very lucky to be joined by River Whittle, Nadema Agard, and Jeremy Dennis, three incredible artists and organizers and people who I feel very privileged to know. But I want to start with you, River, and ask if you can give us some insight into how the Lenape related to this land before colonial intervention, and how your relationships to this land have endured despite colonialism.
Yeah, of course. Can you all hear me okay? Or do I need to talk louder? A little louder? Okay. So, Weli Loku, Nita Lenape, Daluenti, River Whittle, Da. So, my name is River Whittle. I am from the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, as well as the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma. And many of you might not know that the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, originally we were from a larger group of people, and we are known as the Lenape. And Lenape Hoking is our homeland. It includes New York City, but extends far beyond New York City into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, even parts of Massachusetts. And yeah, our homeland, Lenape Hoking, was very large traditionally. We were essentially removed from this area. Our first contact was with an Italian man, and then, the Dutch, and then the English, and eventually what would become the United States. So from here, we were moved into 5 main bands, 2, and there's a very additional third, very small one in Ontario, Canada, 1 in Wisconsin, and 2 in Oklahoma. So, yeah, it's very difficult for us to return home. When we left this place, we left under very dark circumstances. We had scalp bounties on every single Lenape head, and it really wasn't an option to stay here and survive. We were moved, my community was moved over 28 times into different places before we eventually settled the farthest that any Delaware community is in Anadarko, Oklahoma. So throughout this time, we've continuously resisted. We've continuously made efforts to not only, advocate for our land, but also protect our people and protect the culture of our people. Currently, we're engaged in efforts of homecoming, and this looks a lot of different ways. For many decades, there have been groups, elders, women in our communities, matriarchs, and our tribal leaders who have made trips home, oftentimes for repatriation and reburials. That continues to happen, but we're also becoming very organized and trying to return home as, an organized front from all of our different communities, our 5 main communities. So this past week, we actually just participated in a gathering that was women and matriarchs from the 5 main communities gathering together. This is the first time that this has happened in a very long time. We've asked our elders, and they said they can't remember a time that happened. It's a pretty big deal because traditionally we are matriarchal people, and the matriarchs are making a lot of decisions in our communities, and because of colonialism and patriarchy, that has been very severely attacked. So returning home as matriarchs is a big deal, and we were just able to spend a week here. And that was with the help of a lot of allies and accomplices that actually live here in the city. So we're continuing that work, we're continuing the fight, and we are continuing to really try to return home in a multitude of ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important context, and context that informs language, right? Which is something we've been thinking a lot about as we've been crafting and talking through land acknowledgements. At its best, right? How do you think a land acknowledgement can impact both the space and public engagement or awareness within that space, right? Like if we're thinking about a land acknowledgement as a tool, at its best, what does that tool do?
Well, maybe I could jump in, Nadema. I've helped consult on various land acknowledgements, and my hope and goal is always to educate and hopefully encourage change. So that change can be many different forms, from maybe land back being number one. I think a lot of Native people, Indigenous people say no land acknowledgement, we just want land back. So that saves a lot of time, but yeah, I think some people are against that. So otherwise, it's just the basic understanding of the foundation of this nation's history. I think we like to think that it starts at the Declaration of Independence. Nothing happened before that. But really, it's a lot of shame that we're trying to bury. And when you learn about Indigenous history, it's typically trying to avoid that personal shame. And so I think that's something that we're, as individuals, not responsible for. It's what we've been taught growing up, and it's still maintained today. And so even though these are things that happened 400 or 500 years ago, the immediate violence and genocide, for example, we still, as institutions, as individual homeowners, we thrive off of stolen land. And so I wonder if we can shift the dynamic when we read a land acknowledgement, maybe reassess our own power, our own responsibility, what can we contribute? I think with inflation and rent increasing, just try to think of that over 400 or 500 years, what that amounts to. So of course there's the other issue of Indigenous people not really being a fan of capitalism. That's a whole other conversation. I'll stop at that.
Nadema, do you have thoughts that you want to add?
I want to say that the land, we are the stewards of the land. And the colonizer came and in 500 years hasn't done many good things with our land. So it's our time to bring it to the attention of the colonizers that we are the stewards of the land. We are the original people. The land is our mother. The water is life. And we are the ones who can salvage, or at least help, hope to salvage what has been an ecological disaster to our Mother Earth planet.
Yeah. River, did you have thoughts as well?
I just agree with what both of these folks said. I think something we discussed in our working sessions was that I think I'm getting to a point where I'm unwilling to provide any sort of land acknowledgement to institutions before there's been an action plan established. Because I think land acknowledgements provide an opportunity for, as more and more people begin to understand that Indigenous people exist, there's gonna be more and more efforts to incorporate us into neoliberal movements that will continue to colonize our people. And I see land acknowledgements being, I see some people, the potential for some people to use land acknowledgements as an effort to essentially, make it seem like they're in right relations with Indigenous people without actually following up. Yeah. And I think, as we're working with people who might not have any education about Indigenous peoples, it's important to teach them the language and teach them what the language actually means, that it's a connected living thing, and that without action, it really, it's like, I'm gonna acknowledge that I stole your car, and then I'm gonna drive off in it. That's a meme that went around Native Instagram. So it's like, okay, that's a great first step, but it's a way to create a map, I think, for how to go forward.
Yeah, that's very, very well said, and I think you're kind of touching on the second question, right? Because we understand that there's a limit to what language can do, right? And that acknowledge some of these terms are verbs, right? They require action, they require engagement. And so from your perspectives, where do you think institutions, especially art institutions, can take action or begin to take action?
Well, I could jump in with some ideas.
Yeah.
Well, we're hoping that with PACE leading this discussion and forming their own land acknowledgement and following up with action, that smaller institutions can follow the lead. And as we were speaking early on, we mentioned the fact that the land acknowledgement is 10% of the process, and then how do you follow up with that with tangible change? So that change includes, if you're an art institution, are there Native artists in your area that can be highlighted, that their art can be on view? Maybe they could be invited for ticketed events for free. So it's always this horrible feeling when you go to an institution on your ancestral land and you have to pay to access that land. So these small gestures add up to something greater, I think, towards a better and more just world. So I think those are the ideas that immediately come to mind.
Yeah. River and Nadema, are there other thoughts or additions to what Jeremy is saying?
Well, what goes through my head is that we have Native people here in New York City that have been working as artists for almost 50 years. David Van Martine wrote a book about the Native American artists in the New York City art scene. And most people don't even know that a lot of our Indigenous people have influenced one of the big name artists. And so it's time to recognize those people that have been here working as artists in New York City, as Native artists. And the fact that we're Native people and we live in New York City does not make us any less authentic as Native people. For some reason, people are impressed by Native people that come from other places, but there are Native people that live here, been living here for maybe a couple of generations, but they're still Native people, and we still are authentic and have integrity as Native people. So it's time for the big institutions to start opening up their view of what I call the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel is a sacred hoop with the 4 directions. And each direction is a color. We have black, white, yellow, and red. So when you look at the medicine wheel, all the 4 colors are equal. And so these institutions need to look at the medicine wheel as a basis for their approach to recognizing not only indigenous people, but all people, and have an equal footing in the development of the art scene in New York City and elsewhere.
I think a lot of times people forget when they're in cities that it's still indigenous land. There's a lot of Lenape erasure that happens here. And so I think prioritizing Lenape people is so important because anyone who lives here is benefiting off of our displacement. And our displacement is linked to very high rates of a lot of very traumatic things within our communities. And so there's also this very large gap in resources. I think that, you know, what's a small amount for most institutions here, $10,000, $15,000 is like, some of us don't make that in a year, you know? Like, I probably won't make $15,000 this year. The gap is so large that I don't think that most people living their day-to-day lives in this economic space, institutional spaces like this, have an understanding about things like that. And so if you take $15K from your budget and put it towards a group of Lenapes who are trying to come home, like that's like, 10 babies who would have maybe never visited their homelands, who get to like know the sound that the trees make when it blows in the wind and like get to put their feet in the ocean. Like, I think just tangibly brainstorming how resources can be funneled within the community is very important. I think the 2 biggest barriers as Lenape people is we need money for travel and we need a place to stay. So making that happen is, a very key way. I think also providing those resources and then not doing it with any sort of stipulations and demands on Lenape people, because it's really not a fair thing to request of Lenape people. When we come home, we should have the ability to figure out what we want to do and do what we want to do. And I think when you look at the fact that, I always say 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by indigenous people, and we only make up 5% of the population. When you have Lenapes, we have that knowledge, we have the abilities to do it, we have the culture to do it, but we need to be able to access the land at all. And so funding that to make that happen is a key way that balance is gonna be, at least we can try to restore that balance.
Yeah, no, these are all really great answers. And are things that also make me marvel and admire how you take action in your own communities. And I think that, all of you use organizing as a tool to engage with your communities in a way that expands the possibilities of how we consider gathering together, how we consider relating to each other. Nadema, thinking about the work you do with the gallery and the gazebo, River with Branch of Knowledge that you mentioned earlier, and Jeremy, you with Ma's House. And so I'm wondering if you can, for the audience, talk a bit about these spaces that you nurture, and if or how they exemplify a decolonial orientation that I think we've kind of been gesturing towards throughout this evening.
Can I just say something about land acknowledgement that came in my head?
Yeah, please, move with the spirit.
Native people, wherever they go, they always acknowledge that they're on the territory of other Native people. Land acknowledgement has been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's just become something that the non-Native person has become aware of. So I just want to say, because, and whenever we go to any community, we always acknowledge we're on the land of these people. We're on the land of these people, even if they're other indigenous people, because we recognize that. We recognize that that's their territory. So I am the curator of Gallery in the Gazebo. It's an outdoor gallery in a park. And we do shows, 3, sometimes 4 shows a year. And based on the weather and whether it's raining or not, the work is installed and deinstalled every day. And if it's raining, it's not installed. And so we have shows. I started out as an artist who was actually trying to promote the fact that I was having a show in a gallery downtown. And I wanted people to go to the gallery show, so I started putting up banners of my work. And then the man who ran the gallery said, Nadema, you know, you'd be a great curator for the gallery. And we named the Gallery in the Gazebo. And I've been doing that for 7 years. For free. I don't get paid for it. But this year I got a grant and was very happy because I was able to buy stuff for the gallery and pay the artists and pay for the printing because we do paper shows. And so I decided, well, what am I going to do with this gallery and how am I going to educate people? Because I come from an educational background. I was a classroom teacher for 15 years. And I said, I've got to educate these people because they keep on thinking that Indians are dead and that there are Indians that lived in the caves by Inwood Hill Park. Oh, you know, there were Indians that lived in the caves. And I said, yeah, when it was a caveman time, but not when Henry Hudson arrived. And there were Indian people, Native people, and Indigenous people living in Inwood Hill Park up until the 20th century. And there's a street called Indian Road, and that's because Native people, Indigenous people had squatters' rights in certain parks. My great-grandfather had squatters' rights in Central Park, and he sold them. But, so here are these people thinking, oh, the romantic history of Inwood Hill Park and the Indians that lived in the caves. And I wanted them to bring them to the current reality that we're still alive and we're very much involved in our culture. So I used the gallery to educate people, to have shows about Indigenous people, and to bring Indigenous people to the space. I got a grant from the parks, a program with the parks, and I brought in, and 2016 was the Water is Life, what was happening on Standing Rock. And I have relatives on Standing Rock. So I called people and I said, I'd like to have people come from Standing Rock and Cheyenne River, nearby reservation, and talk about what's going on Standing Rock. And all of these people were Lakota people, Lakota speaking and Lakota people. And they came to the garden and they presented. And the following year, I focused on the people that were local people, and I brought Shinnecock, people from Shinnecock Nation, people from nearby Connecticut and Rhode Island to teach about our different lifeways, and all along we were having art exhibits highlighting whatever we were talking about. And then I decided I was going to do a medicine wheel series. And one of the people came up to me because I wanted the medicine wheel series to focus on the 4 sacred colors of humanity, because there's only one race, the human race. We're all 4. There's no different races. We're one race. So you have each group quadrant of the medicine wheel represents those 4 sacred colors of humanity. So I decided to have a show focusing on people from the African diaspora, and a show focusing on people from the Asian diaspora and European and Indigenous. And I did that, and one person came up and he says, well, why are you separating us? And I said, oh, I'm not doing that. I'm representing everyone equally, which has not been the case, especially in New York City And I remember that Powhatan Pindell, a very well-known artist, African-American artist, she curated or was in a show called Our Crow, Jim Crow, because at that time in the 70s or the 80s or whenever it was, 99% of the gallery shows were white males. And a sliver of 1% was divided between Asian, Latino, Native American, and African American. And I belong to a whole circle of people in the arts who were people of color in the arts. And we would meet all the time and talk about how we, needed to be represented more than we were. So my thing is to tell the art institutions, you need to look at the medicine wheel as a model for what should be really very just, and to bring all the four sacred colors together in sort of an equal contribution of their gifts. And because we live the medicine wheel, it isn't just a design, it isn't just a symbol. We live the medicine wheel. So when I had the African American show, people came and brought African foods and African American foods. And then all of these people started sharing and getting to know each other, And then we had the Asian show, and then we had a Japanese artist and a Filipino artist, and they brought Filipino foods, and the Filipinos got to meet Japanese people, and it was just beautiful. Yeah. And of course, the indigenous, and then the European, we had an Italian theme going on, and we brought Italian food. So we covered everybody.
So I didn't even cut you off. I'm just thinking about this framework and how applicable it is to Ma's house and some of the continuities between this work. So I really wanted, Jeremy, if you could speak a bit about that, because I think there's so much that's interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities between our initiatives with the medicine wheel. And I'm actually a visitor as well. I'm from Southampton, Shinnecock ancestral land, 2 hours east of here. And so my ancestors would have visited Manhattan and traded wampum and different goods. And so going back to Shinnecock in Southampton, I started a project called Ma's House in June 2020. And so it was a project that came out of the pandemic. Everything was canceled, a lot of openings in the schedule. And so my family and I decided to try to save our old family home built in the 60s. And so one reality that a lot of people don't realize on reservations is that you can't get loans or mortgages from banks. And so you're pretty much left to save up for an entire room, if you can build room by room if you're lucky, or to hopefully have just a generational house that's passed down. And so we had maybe like $2,000 to commit to renovating a whole house in the Hamptons. And so we ended up having to do a GoFundMe campaign. We raised over $40,000 with many other in-kind donations. And so with that generosity, we ended up dedicating half of the house to become a gallery space for artists of color, a residency program, communal library, and many other things in this very modest, small house. And the idea behind Ma's House just came out of this idea of reciprocity. And so people came forward to help our family, our nation create this space. And so how can we, as a small entity, do the same to help others? And so we're hoping that this can be an example for larger institutions who maybe have $10 million budgets, $100 million budgets. This is small for the Hamptons, I'm sure. And just how can we help the most people with what we have and remember to be grateful for what we have? And I think all of that goes back to the land being most valuable.
Yeah. Very well said. River, did you want to, I know you spoke a little bit about Branch of Knowledge earlier, but did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so Branch of Knowledge is what we're currently calling a collective of Lenape matriarchs that are coming from the 5 different communities currently. And we are organizing to essentially increase presence within our homelands. So short term, that means we're organizing to make a minimum of 2 trips back every year, which is a big deal because we have a lot of Lenape elders who have never visited our homelands. And so, yeah, we're organizing 2 trips back a year annually starting now. And then our long-term goals are acquiring land back, as much land as possible. We would like to, have a place where people can stay, tribal members can stay. We would like to have, an interpretive center or community center, a place where people can learn. So those are kind of our initial goals that we've established this year. And we are able to do this because we're essentially in partnership with an artist that lives and works here. Her name is Emily Johnson. Her social justice dance organization is called Catalyst. And our relationship started just out of meeting each other at an arts event. It was the first time I had ever come home in 2019. And we just became friends, and she would invite me to collaborate on her art projects throughout the year. And she was just listening and having a lot of conversations with me and my dad. My dad's in the crowd right there. So throughout that process, she really came to this understanding of how important it was for her as someone who's benefiting from all the resources here to really put a lot of resources towards bringing us back. So, she worked that into her grants, she worked that into her programming, and she asked me to join her team essentially to organize and facilitate this group. So, that's kind of how it started, and then we are becoming our own entity and our own body. And I think it's an exciting opportunity because we're just one collective of like a lot of different Lenape efforts to becoming home. But it's also an opportunity where we can really have this relationship like what you're talking about, this reciprocal relationship of people who are living here have a place to give back to us, but also we're very interested in educating and sharing and having this traditional role that we would have had if we were able to stay here, which was to welcome guests onto our land. And so if we can restore that original relationship, I think it would be better for all of us. And it's an exciting initiative to start working on that again.
Yeah, it is exciting. And I really want to emphasize that for those of us in this room, right? That when we think about change and we think about what it means for institutions to be in right relation with Indigenous communities, the big question is like, how? How do we start that, right? And there's so many frameworks and so many groups and tools and strategies that we can employ to think about how to do that creatively with reciprocity at the center. And so it's really exciting. It's really, really exciting. Yes, thank you for sharing that. I also want to make sure that we spend some time talking about your work, right? You're all artists. You can see the work, on both of these screens here. And as a viewer, for me, one of the striking aspects of each of your artistic practices is that they really refute Indigenous erasure and cultural erasure. And so I'm wondering if you all can speak to how your work insists on affirming a contemporary Indigenous presence.
Oh, I could start. Well, some of the photos I have on these screen slides are from a series called Rise. And so it's a digital photography series of self-portraits in myself wearing traditional regalia. So that's buckskin leather, it might be feathers adorning my regalia and other accessories. And it's really this idea of staging the idea of maybe a dream of Indigenous people reoccupying their land, or what does it mean when in our popular mind or popular culture or imagination, the idea of interacting or interfacing with Indigenous people. Sometimes it's the stereotype, sometimes it's the realism or the shock of seeing Indigenous people for the first time and having that conflict of who really belongs on the land. And so these are some of the slides on the screen now. And really the work with land acknowledgements is almost like a step above just the basic understanding that Indigenous people are still here, they still are in their homelands, some have been still removed and are waiting for that land back to happen. And being at Shinnecock, I think it's just incredible that we still have the land in the first place. But in the Hamptons, most people don't even know we're still there. And so there's this basic humanization of just acknowledging our presence. That's the first thing. Allowing us to belong and simply exist is another. And then allowing us to have basic resources like being able to thrive as we once did for thousands of years. And so there's a lot of education that needs to happen, and also just everyday living things that we need to consider and allow Native people to have access to. So as an artist, I try to just create that acknowledgement and awareness of our continued presence.
Do you have a thought, Nadema?
Oh, yeah. Well, mutual respect and reciprocity is something that is part of who we are. It's like we can't survive unless we have that. We have to have mutual respect and reciprocity. The women of the Northern Plains, including the Lakota women, they painted earth paintings on rawhide. They used a symbol called a kapemni. It looks like an X, but it's actually a cone on the top and a cone on the bottom, like a teepee shaped and an ice cream cone. And then there's the four directions, and that is the place where the stars are born. So I've been working on doing contemporary versions of those kapemnis. I continue that tradition from time immemorial. I use contemporary materials, but the content is very indigenous. And a lot of my work comes out of ceremonies. There's one called Grandmother Moon that you've been watching every now and then pass through the slide. That comes out of ceremonies. That comes out of attending full moon ceremonies in Minnesota when I lived in Minnesota with my Ojibwe sisters and brothers out there. I went to all kinds of ceremonies, and then the four colors of corn in that Grandmother Moon piece comes from the Hopi tradition, where they grow four colors of corn, and they separate them. They grow them separately, and it represents the four sacred colors of humanity. And they were told by the Creator to grow them separately. And the Virgin of Guadalupe is the Corn Mother. I'm a border crosser, a spiritual border crosser. I work with images from, especially divine feminine images. I work with those images because I don't choose them, they choose me. And so I was chosen by the Virgin of Guadalupe, AKA Tonantzin, who's actually a goddess of the Mexica or Aztec people. And she called on me, and then I started, creating work about her. And then I saw the parallels between who she was and who the Corn Mother was for our Cherokee people. And also there's parallels between that and White Buffalo Calf Maiden of the Lakota people. So I work with the spirits, I work with the divine feminines. They talk to me, I make art. I remember when I was working on that medicine, that piece that you see, the healing piece, that's on the screen. I was working on it, and it's a birth opening. I work with a lot of birth openings because I believe that that place is a sacred place, and that we come from the spirit world to the material world through that door. And it has been desacralized and vulgarized, but it's a sacred place. And so I work with that symbol. And one day I was working on that piece, and I needed a sweetgrass. I said, I want to put the sweetgrass, cedar, sage, and those are our plants that we use for medicine. I says, I want to use that, but maybe, I don't know, maybe the Ojibwe people might not like the idea if I do that. And then my doorbell rang, and this woman, who's a friend of mine, she's Ojibwe, and she said, Nadema, I have a present for you. Guess what was? It was sweetgrass. And then I said, okay, I can do this. So this is, this is how I make art. It isn't just to, be trendy or whatever. I make art because it comes from my authentic relationship with our spirit world is as real as this world. When I was a little girl, my grandmother talked about spirits like they were your neighbors, okay? So the spirit and growing up in New York City, it didn't matter. I grew up in the projects, the reservation for people of color in New York City. And I grew up there, and my dad told me one day, he says, "You see all those people out there?" And I said, "Yeah, what about it, Daddy?" He says, "You're not like them." I said, "What do you mean I'm not like them?" And then he said, and my dad was very proud of being Lakota. He said, "You Blackfeet Sioux." Back then, we didn't say Si Hasapa Lakota. We said it in English, Blackfeet Sioux. And then I went back home to the reservation, and my family are the only family on Standing Rock that are Blackfeet Sioux. So there's a strong connection with who I am, and from the time I was a little girl. And I always wanted to know my family. I wanted to know my roots, and I went to all my ancestral homelands. I visit all of them, and I feel very connected. And it's hard when you're intertribal, but I manage it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think I'll talk about the one piece that has two women on it. It's a digital collage. Those are long hats. We're related to them. They're relatives, ancestor relatives. But I wanted to talk about that because it's important. It includes a piece of art that's not mine, and it's important because I made it to try to honor an experience of coming back to this area that was so reciprocal and so caring. And it's a big reason why I get very emotional about my relationship with Dio, the organizer. Because traditionally, those of us who are from, the Northeast of the United States, however you want to talk about this area, we have traditional relationships. And as Lenape people, we were pushed so far away that to restore those traditional relationships feels very healing to us. So I guess it was the second time, it was the same month that I had come back here for the first time. The second time I had come back, we were able to go up to Akwesasne where the Mohawks live, and they were able to share with us a song and dance that they kept for us. They kept this for us because they knew that we were leaving and that we had to leave and that we might lose a lot. And according to what we were told, we don't even in Oklahoma, we don't even really sing that way anymore. So it really is something that they've kept for us from a very, very, very long time ago. They welcomed us into their longhouse. They fed us, they gave us these songs and dances, and they took care of us the way that you take care of a relative that leaves and has finally returned back home. And so it was very, very healing because it can be very overstimulating to come back to the city and not have that traditional relationship. And we were told Lenapes not only took refuge with some Mohawks, also some Shinnecock, and also just generally Six Nations folks, especially in Canada. There are communities, the Six Nations at Grand River, I was told by Rachel Snake, who's from the Muncie Delawares in Ontario, that the Six Nations folks just surrounded the Lenapes and protected them. And so there's a lot that really I feel like owe to the Haudenosaunee. But I was also told that in their Hiawatha belt, they have these squares to represent the people, and that one was enlarged when our Lenapes joined with them. And so this piece that I made when COVID started happening and we were all very afraid of death, I was really thinking about how the Mohawks took us in and took care of us and reminded us that like leaving and being forced from our homelands, it did feel like death. But through our relationships with each other and through that care, I don't think that we can ever really die. And you have these things that have been so severely attacked that through community, have been protected. And so in that you have the belt that's holding these aunties that were forced from their homelands. And on there it says, we are everlasting. And so I was trying to really pay homage to that, but also just remind ourselves that, you know, there are these ways that we can continue existing on. And I want my art to be representative of that, and I want my art to be a call for people to join in on that. Hence the billboard that was up in Apache territory in New Mexico, and it just says the land needs its people. Not only does the land need the indigenous people of the area first and foremost, but it also needs the people who are here to act like its people, to act like a family member to it and to each other.
I love that, and I want to link that to a question in a moment before we get there. And then we want to have some time for the audience to ask some questions. But we've been talking about land back a lot, right? And we've been mentioning decolonization. It's important to remember that like decolonization is not a metaphor, right? And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about land back or other decolonial movements that inspire you or your work. And again, let's keep our answers a little bit brief so we can have some time for the audience as well.
Well, I can speak for Shinnecock and just the land back that we are attempting, but it's like a Sisyphus type of situation. We have over 4,000 square acres of land that we're trying to regain. That was just looking at history. If you can read that, it's free to access online. It's just so blatant that our land was stripped from us. And if you look at the laws, it should have been returned to us immediately, but it's just a situation where I guess no one wanted to acknowledge it, no one wanted to do the right thing. It's all kind of part of the same conversation we've been saying tonight, just the idea that if you don't acknowledge Native people, then slowly you're able to just steal their land and tell your descendants that there's no one left to steward that land. There's no indigenous people left to take care of that land. And so in the Hamptons, real estate's the #1 industry. We have golf courses everywhere. We have mansions. The worst thing is that most of this land is just vacant and just accumulating value. And so this land could be utilized by the more than 600 Shinnecock tribal members who are still there year round. They don't go to their Florida or wherever their third or fourth house is. And so it is something that could be undone by the New York State governor. That's something that would be amazing, but hasn't been done for over 250 years. And it could be also done by individuals. So because we're such a, I guess historically we contacted the settlers and colonists early in the timeline, so our land status is in this really vague place. So acquiring land in that process is a little bit uncharted territory, I suppose. So we're still learning how to do that. We're still learning how to approach people for that. But at the end of the day, that's really, I think, making the world a better place. It's something that when I think of like the telescopes we're sending into space that see the edge of the universe, which is amazing. Like all this is still based on stolen land and genocide and the many other things that we've never acknowledged or had reconciliation over. And so I think if we want to just have a clear conscience, we have to undo, well, we can't really undo history, but make the world a better place.
Yeah, and begin to attend to it. Do either of you have thoughts on land back before we shift to our last question about how we attend to that?
Well, I'm just going to say that both of us participated in a billboard project of art pieces around the country. And they were put up in the communities of your choice. I know there was one that was put up out in Long Island, and mine was put up in Mandan, North Dakota, because it's like the nearest town town to the Standing Rock Reservation, and you also did, it's up there on the screen, your billboard for land back, which is, of course, something we support tremendously. Land back, returning the land to the people, and little by little, around the country and around the Western Hemisphere and around the world, our indigenous people are getting our land back. Aboriginal Australian people, Maori people, Native North American, Native Indigenous people of South America, we're getting our land back. And it's really a wonderful thing to get our news that this particular community got land back, and this, you know. So yeah, that's really, of course we want our land back. It's time to replenish the Mother Earth and save it.
Yeah. River, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very inspired by just Black and Indigenous activists who are aggressively anti-capitalist, because I think their work is leading the way for a chance at survival. When, you know, you look at the corporations and militaries are having the biggest effects on climate change, and by the time I'm 80, things are going to be significantly different. Like, people won't be able to live here unless we change it now. And we're not going to be able to stop the overconsumptive behavior and the extraction unless we reorient ourselves around a system that is not capitalism. And when you want to know, okay, well then what system? Indigenous people are a great people to ask, because in our communities, within our communities, a lot of times, you know, person to person, family to family, we do still operate that way with each other. And our cultural values are still based in reciprocity and relationship as opposed to extraction. There's a ton of efforts that are doing that. So yeah, I'm very inspired by those.
But I think that's a really good point, and something that I want to bring to our final question before we open it up to the audience. In thinking about what it means, when we talk about right relations, right? We're talking about reciprocal relationships with communities. And I think that reciprocity piece that you just said is something that's really important and really critical and really exciting. And so I'm wondering, for you all, as a kind of closing thought to kind of round out the night, as we think about what is needed for institutions to build relationships with communities, what does that entail on both sides? Right? What does that entail on the side of institutions who are looking to build relationships with communities in new and exciting and perhaps unprecedented ways? And what does it look like for communities who are looking to engage with institutions in ways that are unprecedented?
You need to talk to the elders. You just can't make a decision and say, this is what we want to do for you. I was a repatriation director for the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. The first thing that I did was call all the grandmas and the grandpas, bring them together and say, we're going to go to museums and ask for our things to be returned. Is that okay with you? Okay? We need to go to the elders. We need to have the protocol understood, because we have an indigenous protocol just like you have your protocol. So we have to understand and respect that protocol, and before we do anything, go to the elders and get the permission of the whole community, not just one person. We just, you know, we're here to represent our communities. We're not here to represent ourselves. We're here because we have a collective consciousness about who we are. So we need to go to the elders and ask them about how we can come up, you know, we can come up with some suggestions, which we've had, but that's just like, you know, a real small thing. We need to if we're going to make really a big change in the dynamic between, the mutual respect and reciprocity. We're giving something too. You're not just giving something to us, okay? Because your idea, or I'm not saying you particularly in the audience, the idea of the dominant culture's wealth is having things and having money and material things. For Indian people, wealth is not material. Wealth is like a man who has a beautiful family that takes care of him, okay? So we have a different idea of wealth. Wealth is culture. Wealth are our songs. Wealth are our dances. Wealth are our beautiful regalias that are themselves artwork. Because we dance, we make art, we dance art, we are art. We aren't just separated in an institution. Art isn't for us separated in an institution. It's part of everyday life. So, and there's a whole other component of art in the sacred that we don't have time to talk about.
Thank you so much for that. Jeremy, River, any closing thoughts around that?
Well, just sort of like reflections and reverberations of what we've been saying, just having Native voices at the table, whether that's who you're representing, if you're an art institution, whether that's nonprofit or for-profit, maybe having Native people on the board, consulting on curation. And this is really a responsibility for art institutions to actually represent the communities that they're surrounded by. And so to not have any Native people in these different roles, you're basically saying that they don't exist. And so it is possible, and it does take work. But I think even if you're not doing a Native-themed show or Native content show, you are on Native land, so there is work that can be done in a positive way. And so I think every institution has that work to do today.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add is that I think there should be a very intense commitment to education for each individual that works within these institutions, because I think there's probably a lot of resistance, especially from a lot of the bigwigs in a lot of these institutions, to do any sort of thing that would actually align with Indigenous values. And so having individuals within these institutions that are committed to education, educating themselves, and being open to learning, like step by step by step, and also figuring out how to do that with the people that are on your team and the people that are, higher up, I think is very important, because there's a big gap that we need to fill. And, Lenapes can't do it every day, so y'all got to do it. So yeah, I think there's a big educational and cultural shift that needs to happen as well.
Yeah. Everyone, please join me in thanking you all for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. Again, very grateful for you all. And a reminder that, these are huge, immense topics that we're talking about. There's no way to get through all of them in one evening, but I feel very grateful for the time that we're able to have you here. Are there any questions? Any questions? I see some pensive expressions throughout the room. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Hi. I was curious, you mentioned that mortgages and loans weren't options, and where does that come from, and how do you feel about that?
Oh, sure. About the question about mortgages and loans from banks, that goes back to the idea that Indian territory or reservations, you can't really seize the house or seize the land as a bank. So they just outright don't offer you that type of support. And so I don't even know how maybe in the 1800s we had whalers in our community, and that was very profitable during the time. And so even some of the homesteads that are on our territory today come from that period. They just then kept up. But it's very hard to imagine, how do you even build a home if you have a low income and you can't get a loan or any type of support. And so a lot of it comes back to the idea of community coming together and just helping each other accomplish that. And so it is something that still affects us today. And we were lucky at Ma's house to have that crowdfunding. A lot of community members, they live in houses that have mold issues, moisture issues, floods in their basements and even the first floor. And so it's really just like these basic living things that we need to take care of before we even get to these overarching issues beyond that.
Are there other questions? We have a hand in the back here.
Hi, I really enjoyed this. I think, full disclosure, so I went to business school, and so hearing you talk about this sort of native or indigenous perspective while climate change is happening, while you're in this capitalist political atmosphere, but there's obviously so much, and there are all these other issues like, you're on. I think it's interesting that you said that you're in like this very valuable land when you were here to begin with, and like that's just the land that you were on, but it's so highly valued right now. And so it just seems like you have a lot to offer because we came here recently, but your ancestors, like the indigenous people have been here for so long, so you understand the land. Like your sense of humanity understands the idea that weather is a balance. And so to go, like it can't that weather is a balance, it can go above 125 degrees Fahrenheit because you can't grow above the balance. And so I just think that your connection to value is interesting because there is stress there. There is the United States of America and then there's you. And so I was wondering if you could sort of talk about the interplay, like how in your methods, how you are thinking about managing kind of the fact that there is this huge force that's different, but then ultimately can benefit from being around you. I'd also like to say that I think land around you should be more valuable so that people can still get value without having to push you off. It should be that being connected to a culture like that when you have money is more valuable because you know how to run things in a way that's smoother for everything else. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something that we have to figure out every day because the dissonance between like indigenous reality and like everyone else, particularly like settlers, and the understanding of like what's going on is so vast. But I don't know, I like to name those things a lot. Like I like to name the United States as a colony. The United States is a European colony that never left. So we didn't ever gain our independence. Like, the United States gained their independence from Britain or whatever, but like we don't have an Independence Day because the occupation is still here. And that's something we have to grapple with and figure out how to live under. But I think one way that I try to like make that people understand that reality is just naming things like that explicitly for what they are. But it can be really hard because like when you tell just like a person who, has no context for that it doesn't feel like reality to them. And it's a lot of gaslighting that you have to like process. And for me, it's almost more intense here because there's like literally so many millions of people that have no idea about what it means to be a Lenape person or what it means to be on Lenape land.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. Nadema made a good point that reflections and thoughts are also welcome. So if there are no questions, this is an open space for us to continue to think and brainstorm and process together. So within a time constraint. But thank you for the question. Were there other questions or other hands in this space? Yeah.
I guess I have a question for the audience, and it's not so much for the panelists, but just out of curiosity. like land ownership with your family? Just out of curiosity, I'm just curious to see. And yeah, just like, you know, this is a beautiful moment right now. How many of you, you're coming to this event to listen and connect in with where you are in present day, but how many of you are in connection with the people whose land your family owns land on? And how do we start to do this work right now in real time? And this is the opportunity right here. It's like we're saying we have a responsibility to be of the land. The land needs its people. River was just expressing it needs us to be present. And if the rest of our family is unable to be present, then that means it's us to be present. And that means that we have to go have the conversations. It's the holiday season. We're probably going to see our family. Sit down at your table around that food and say, hey, you know, let's take some money off the bank, a good amount, every year, and give it back. Let's get this house when it's time to go and you're thinking of giving it to me. I'm going to give it to the tribe. I'm going to give it to these people. And so just that reminder that it's right here, it's real time, and it's a beautiful moment. It's exciting. It feels good. You're helping your ancestors. You're healing your mind. You're healing the earth. You feel overwhelmed by what to do on the planet. Opportunities right here, right now. Welcome. It's fun.
It is. It's fun. No, seriously, it's fun. It's fun and it's exciting. And I really don't want us to lose sight of that, right? That to that point, there's so many ways to begin to engage in meaningful relationship building, right? We've been talking about that a lot within an institutional context, but it's something that also extends from individual relationships. I mean, I feel very grateful that, you know, we are starting to all have individual relationships with each other. That's important. That's what sustains larger work. And so thank you so much for that comment, because I think that you're so right. It's super exciting, and there's so much space to, within your own personal lives, figure out, what does that look like? How do I engage with that in a way that feels reciprocal and exciting? Yeah, sorry, you got me jazzed up.
I am trying to create a network of people who have extra rooms, homes, whatever, who are willing to open up their space to Lenape people when they come back. And I have a whole little questionnaire that I am sending people, you know, how many, do you have a preference for genders, COVID protocols, like a whole, like, we're being very considerate about it, and it will be a whole process. But if you're interested in potentially, you know, building that, or if you have access to financial support, maybe not an extra house, but you could put a Lenape up in a hotel to come home for a week, you know? So if you want to be on that list, come find me after.
Yeah, that's great. To close, and again, thank you all so much for coming out tonight and being a part of this conversation with us. To close, I want to read the land acknowledgement that we've worked on and we've been thinking about, because again, it's a compass towards action. And I really don't want us to lose sight of that, and really want to echo the statement that was made here earlier, right? That there's so many ways to begin to think about action, to begin to think about community building and relationship building. And this is kind of, as an institution, how we're thinking about how we can do that and how we can begin to do that, and recognize that it's an ongoing process and it's messy and we will make mistakes, and that's part of the process. Pace Gallery is located on the land of Lenape communities who have come to be known as the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, the Delaware Nation of Lenni Lenape in Anadarko, Oklahoma, the Stockbridge-Muncie Mohican community in Bowler, Wisconsin, the Muncie-Delaware Nation at Muncie, Ontario, Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, Ontario, and the Delaware Six Nations in Six Nations of the Grand River, Ontario. Beginning in the 16th century, Lenape people were violently displaced through genocidal tactics and colonialism. These communities are in the process of restoring their relationships to this land. As an institution, we recognize our responsibility of addressing legacies of settler colonialism that have impacted Indigenous and Black communities. In the spirit of mutual respect and reciprocity, PACE is invested in supporting ongoing Lenape efforts to continue to increase Lenape presence in Lenape-Hoking. PACE is also invested in supporting the Indigenous peoples who have historically gathered and continue to gather on this land. I feel very grateful to know you and very excited to continue this work with you all. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a good night.